Hi, welcome to my session on understanding and maximizing the Lightroom Classic to Photoshop workflow. In this session, what I really want to focus on is the understanding part, maximizing, and workflow. Specifically the workflow between Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. We're going to do a little bit of Photoshop, but this isn't a Photoshop session. And we're going to spend time in Lightroom Classic, but it's not necessarily on using Lightroom Classic to edit a photo. It's really focused on the going back and forth between the two and how to get the most out of it, what settings you might want to consider, and what additional ways you could take advantage of Photoshop, assuming Lightroom Classic is your home base, your go-to place for your photography. So that's our focus here. And my hope is by the end of this, you'll be able to answer for yourself the question of when do I go to Photoshop and how? What's the best way to do that? So starting off here in Lightroom Classic, I want to talk about the settings you want to consider, and then we'll switch over to Photoshop and look at some settings there and go through some workflow scenario examples. Now, I prepared a workbook to go along with this session that's like 20 pages or more. It's chock full of stuff, and it goes into some of the steps of some of the Photoshop things that I'll show here. But like I said, this isn't really a Photoshop class, so I'm going to kind of try to go through those parts quickly to put a greater emphasis on all the things we can do between these two programs. All right. So starting here in Lightroom Classic, if you're on a Mac, go up to the Lightroom Classic menu. If I was on Windows, I'd go to the Edit menu and come down to Preferences. Specifically, we're going to go to External Editing. Now, by default, this is going to be set to TIFF, and this might be set to 240, but it's going to be a ProPhoto RGB 16-bit color space image that results from when you send a file over to Photoshop. What do I mean by that? So, assuming we're starting in Lightroom Classic with a raw photo, which is ideally what it's designed around, but it certainly supports TIFF, PSD, JPEG, and PNG files, and even a little bit of video files. But the conceptual framework I want you to work with is Lightroom Classic is designed to help a digital photographer with a raw workflow, and supports the other ones too. Assuming you're capturing in RAW, you're trying to capture as much information, color data, information, scene information, as possible. And so the ideal workflow between Lightroom Classic and Photoshop is to retain as much of that data as possible along for the ride. After all, when software is working on our images, it's math, right? And so the more data we have, the smaller those rounding numbers are, the better our results. So Lightroom Classic's defaults are to create the copy that is sent to Photoshop in TIFF format, but you could also choose PSD. They both support all the same things in terms of layers and bit depth and features in Photoshop. So functionally, they both do the same job. Where the difference may come down in is ultimate file size of the final version of the file. If you typically only have a single layer, you're just sending over, the raw photo, it becomes a TIFF file or a PSD file. You're editing on that file, you save and close it. The TIFF and the PSD are going to be probably in the same size, depending, especially if you take and use the compressed TIFF format. What I've found is if you have a multi-layered file, the TIFF file tends to be a little bit larger when you're dealing with a 16-bit file. These days, I don't worry so much about file size due to the cost of hard drive space going down and the hardware improving in terms of performance, but it's just something to be mindful of. Now, some people are just old school Photoshop people, and PSD is Photoshop format, and they just like PSD, and they go with PSD. Other people see a PSD as a layered file, and maybe TIFF is a flattened finished file. So if you conceptually have specific meanings associated with different file types, by all means, follow that. I'm just wanting to tell you there's functionally, in terms of how these two work together, there's no difference. So you can choose either one and get the same benefits. But explore for yourself and find out what what works best in your workflow. As it says here, PSD can be less efficient than TIFF with respect to metadata updates. I haven't noticed that. But it is an important point here on making sure if you do use PSD that maximize compatibility is turned on in Photoshop's preferences. So when we switch over to Photoshop, we'll make sure you know where that is if you choose PSD. And to be honest, I have both PSD and TIFF files. I kind of treat them as interchangeable layer supporting files. So make your best choice and then don't worry about it anymore. All right. So this field right here, resolution. When you send a copy from Lightroom Classic with Lightroom Classic edits, it's going to be the same pixel dimensions as the original cropped file. So if you don't crop it, it's the same pixel dimensions as the source file. If you crop it, it'll be the cropped dimensions when it goes over to Photoshop. In other words, Lightroom Classic in this workflow, in this dialog, doesn't change the pixel dimensions. So that means that this field right here is simply a metadata tag that would only come into play at the time you're printing the file. Since we're not changing the pixel dimensions, theoretically, you could put any number in this field that you want. But for some folks, they like 300 pixels per inch. And so put it in there if it makes you feel better. You can always change it before you print it. So yes, you can change it. But if it helps you sleep at night, put in 300 and make that your go-to number. Now, when you install, I'm assuming you have the Creative Cloud Photography plan, which gives you access to the latest version of Photoshop, latest version of Lightroom Classic, as soon as they come out. By default, the latest version of Photoshop installed will be your primary external editor right here. If you have additional third-party image editors, if you have older versions of Photoshop, if you have maybe Photoshop Elements, there may be other tools you use in your workflow and you want to send from Lightroom Classic to that other image editor. That's primarily what this additional or external editor section is all about, where you can configure in the same file format, color space, bit depth as above, but it will send to typically a different program. Now, I have set up an additional or external editor for Photoshop that sends over an 8-bit sRGB PSD file. That was because I had a specific job where I needed that. I needed PSD files and I needed to be an sRGB 8-bit. So instead of sending over this massive file and then having to convert in Photoshop, I just did that conversion right here so that the copy I wanted to open up was already ready for me to go for that particular job. So you can do it that way too. But you can see you can have a whole bunch of other external editors here. And typically when you install that third-party software, it's going to install this configuration for you. So typically you don't have to do anything more with those. But I did add one in for Photoshop Elements, and I still have a very old version of Nik Snapseed for desktop still working on here, and I can figure that in. So you can configure basically any other third-party editor that you want to be able to send via this shortcut over to that tool. So I'm going to close this just for a second, just so you can see. So whatever you have lined up in this preset is what will appear when you go to the photo menu and you go to edit in. At the top will always be the latest version of Photoshop. And then under that will be whatever preset is selected on that preference panel to go in this location. So Command or Control E is your shortcut here. And then there's an additional shortcut. So if you find that useful, you can just add in this additional modifier key and send to that editor instead, or send to the same editor with a different file format configuration if that makes sense in your workflow. So let me come back up to this one more time. And so if you change this, so say I change that to good old Snapseed there, different file format, color space, all that fills in. Go to that menu, edit in, and now that is set as my additional editor. I can still access all those presets here, but this one has the shortcut. So just file that away in case that's useful for you. All right, let me show you how to create one of those customized additional or external editor presets before we jump on over to Photoshop. So back into the preferences here under external editing, all you need to do is select the desired application. So when you click the choose button, you're going to go to wherever your application is stored. So on Mac, that's in your applications folder. On Windows, it's program files. And you want to dial down to choose the specific application file that basically it's the exe file on Windows, the app file here. And you want to choose that application. All right, so that application is dialed in, whichever one you want, whatever external editor you want that to be. Then just dial in the file format, color space, bit depth, resolution, whatever is pertinent to the file type that you select. Then click this menu and choose Save Current Settings as a new preset. All right, dial that in, click Create, and now that's added to your preset drop-down menu. And so bonus tip, if you ever want to delete one of these, if you've created these, all you do is select the one you want to delete and then choose delete the preset. So if I hadn't had that one selected, you gotta select it, then you come back in and choose delete that preset. And that's all you need to do, all right? And so you can create as many as you want, different versions of them, and then once you've got it dialed in, you can use them. All right, so that's not Photoshop. So let's jump back over here. So when you have a photo selected, let's say we've done all the editing in this inside of Lightroom Classic, and I just want to do like a final sharpen, something like that inside of Photoshop. When I'm ready to go, I can use that Edit in Photoshop menu this way. I could use the keyboard shortcut or the Photo in Edit in menu up on the top. However you want to get there is fine. The keyboard shortcut, Command or Control E, is definitely the fastest way to do it. So this photo would have come over based on my preferences here, right? So this will end up being a PSD file, ProPhoto RGB 16-bit. At this point, I haven't saved it. Let me just turn this on so I can zoom in on my cursor here. So it's still the same file name and still same file extension. We see it's 16-bit. How else can we see the color space? So down here at the bottom, you can set the profile to show in this menu command. All right, by default, I think it's set to document sizes, which isn't super helpful in my opinion. But document profile will tell you the embedded profile, the color space that we're working in. One of the areas that I hear questions about is, well, if I'm in ProPhoto RGB inside of Lightroom Classic and I send that over to Photoshop, how do I make sure it stays in ProPhoto RGB 16-bit color space? Well, by default, it probably already does. That's controlled by this Edit Color Settings menu. If you've got, this is, I think, the default one in here, this option dialed in, then look under Color Management Policies, and it's probably already set to Preserve Embedded Profile. That means when Photoshop is opening a photo, its policy is to preserve the embedded color space and continue editing in that color space until you manually change it. Even though my working RGB space is sRGB. Now, the working RGB space for me is important because I often do other work for web or other things where I'm creating documents from scratch, a blank canvas. When you go to File New in Photoshop and create a new document, it uses your working RGB space, assuming you're working RGB, for that as the default color space for that document. I wouldn't want a new document to be a ProPhoto RGB color space new document. That doesn't make any sense in my workflow. But for me, sRGB is. As long as my color management policy is preserve embedded profile, I can have my working RGB in whatever makes the most sense for my workflow outside of editing. When I'm sending from Lightroom Classic, it's always going to do the right thing. Now, if you're getting prompted about profile mismatches, if you need your working RGB space in something like sRGB, then all you need to do is turn off Ask When Opening and it won't bother you anymore. Notice I didn't get any prompt, it just opened up and it stayed in ProPhoto RGB 16-bit, exactly what I wanted it to do. Now, there might be some instances where you want to be prompted, maybe if the profile is missing, if you're opening a new file in Photoshop directly, something you download off the web, that might be helpful. Or if you're doing compositing and you're pasting between and you want to have that heads up, then those two you might want to be warned about. But for a typical Lightroom Classic to Photoshop workflow, you don't need to be prompted every time. Just set your working RGB space to whatever makes the most sense for your workflow. Make sure preserve embedded profile, and just don't worry about it, and it'll all be fine. So I sent this over to Photoshop for some editing, and as at this point, it's still showing the DNG file extension because I haven't saved it yet, and it doesn't exist on my hard drive yet. If we switch back to Lightroom Classic for a second, let me close this out, we can see that I am in a collection right now. All right, so if I press the G key, I am in this collection, and if I press J, all right, there's my source file, and it's a DNG file. Back in Photoshop, as soon as I'm ready to save this, which you can do immediately, I'll go up to File and Save. Not Save As, but I'm going to go to Save, and that will automatically transform this into the file format that I designated in Lightroom Classic's preferences. So it is now showing as a PSD file, still 16-bit, still ProPhoto RGB. And if I switch back over to Lightroom, we see that my original DNG file is here, and the new copy in PSD format was added to the collection. And if I right-click on this and choose Go to Folder and Library, we'll see in my folder that copy is also there too. So that hook from Lightroom Classic to Photoshop, all you need to do is start in Lightroom, shortcut or menu command, go to Photoshop, File, Save, and boom. That copy is saved to the hard drive in the same folder as your source file. And if you start in a collection, as I did, it'll be added to that collection. It's a pretty smooth workflow without you having to do a whole lot of setup. If you ever do this type of workflow and the copy isn't added to the collection, the most common reason I've seen for that is that instead of selecting the actual collection, you had a collection set selected. And if you select a parent collection set, of which this is not in one, then it'll still look like you're selecting the photo in the collection. But because you have a parent collection set selected, the copy's not, it doesn't know where to add the copy. It will still be in the folder. It should always be in the folder, but it may not end up in the collection. So always make sure you have a regular collection selected. If you have a smart collection selected, it may not show up if the copy doesn't match the criteria for that smart collection. So if you're working from a regular collection, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that, make sure you have that collection selected before you send it over, and the copy should end up right there. All right, so here I am in Photoshop. I want to point out another preference setting in Photoshop that pertains to PSD files. I mentioned that earlier. So if we go to Photoshop, Preferences on Mac, under Edit on Windows, and come down to File Handling, there's this Maximize PSD, PSB file compatibility. Set that to always, and you won't get prompted about it. And more importantly, Lightroom Classic will be able to import the resulting PSD file. Because if you don't have this set and you maybe set it to never or ask, and when it's asked you say no, Lightroom Classic can only support a PSD file that was maximized for compatibility. And for PSB. PSB is the large document file format from Photoshop, and Lightroom Classic does now support PSB file types. We came to Photoshop. What do we want to do? Well, typical workflow, this is maybe a finishing move. So maybe I'll grab an action for sharpening, and I will just apply that sharpening to this file and evaluate it. All right, there it is without it. There's with the sharpening. It's subtle, but I like it. So now that I've done my edits, I'm going to go up to File and Save, or the shortcut, Command or Control S, and then File and Close. or Command or Control W. And so once this file is saved, and it's a little bit larger file, it will close out of here. And now when I return to Lightroom, the edited version of this is now selected and ready to go. So this is basically my new master version, because this has all of the edits plus the original raw capture data that I worked on in Lightroom, plus all the edits in Photoshop. And now I might be ready to send this off via export to a client, to get printed, to share on social media, or whatever my purpose is. This is where I would export, and here is where I would change file format to maybe JPEG, or I would change color space to a more relevant output color space like sRGB. This is where I might resize it smaller if that's what needed to be done, or apply sharpening for screen, or whatever those other additional things that are output specific might be. Start in Lightroom, finish in Photoshop, output for your needs is the typical type of workflow and how these two work together. Now let's build on that and see what other reasons why you might start in Lightroom Classic and go to Photoshop. Well, one might be for if you do any type of composites, right? So I took this photo of my son and his great pandemic hair. We did a hike up to the top of a mountain, got there, and it was all fogged in. So I composited him with this mountain background, right? So how do we do that? Well, I can't go into all of the steps in this because I don't have time, but I'll just show you the basics. But more importantly, I want to show this other area of concern is, what if I start in Lightroom Classic, I create some type of layered file, and now I need to go back to Photoshop with the layered file, and I want to be able to see those individual layers because maybe I want to change something or add something or whatever your reason is. So I'm going to select the layered PSD file here, and I'll right click so you can see what I'm doing and choose the Edit in Photoshop command. And now I get this prompt. I didn't get that prompt when I selected the raw file. You will never get prompted when you select a raw file, because the only choice when a raw file is selected is to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. Boom, period, end of sentence. In the very beginning of Lightroom's existence, we would get the prompt with the raw file, but that hasn't been true in over a decade probably. Because there was no point. It was the only option. This would come up and it would be already checked and we'd click edit. So it just removed that step out of the way. When you have a non-raw file selected, PSD, TIFF, JPEG, PNG, so on, then you get this prompt, because now you really need to make your choice. If I want to access the layered version of this, I want to choose Edit Original. Edit Original is just like using the File Open menu in Photoshop and drilling down to where this photo resides on my hard drive, selecting it, and opening it into Photoshop. It will only have on it the edits that I did in Photoshop. Now, as I can see here by looking at the thumbnail badges, there's no badge on this photo for having been edited in the Develop module. That's what this little plus minus badge means. This was edited in Develop, not. So there's no additional Lightroom edits that I applied to the layered file. So this point is kind of irrelevant anyway, right? I don't want to create a new copy. There's no adjustments to apply anyway, so scratch that off the list. Edit a copy? Well, if I wanted to duplicate the layered file for some reason, maybe to try a different technique or make an iterative copy or whatever my reasoning is, then maybe there have been times where choosing Edit a copy has been useful. But mostly you will choose Edit Original to edit the original file. Lightroom adjustments will not be visible. That just means if I applied additional Lightroom adjustments to this, they would not be visible. Let me cancel out of this and just make sure that point is clear. If I switch to Develop, and let me just put on something really obvious here. We'll do a color grade so that we can see. All right, so there's a really obvious color. Not his color, but we'll just work with me here. All right, so now we can see I applied a Lightroom adjustment. All right, we see the badge, we see the hideous color. Now when I go Edit in, Open in Photoshop, I get the same prompt. Notice Lightroom adjustments will not be visible. So when this copy opens in Photoshop, will we see the green leprechaun version? No, we won't. So I'll click on Edit and then switch over to Photoshop. Once it opens, and here it comes, boom, right? No leprechaun. But I've got my layers, right? That's what I came here to do, was to work on the layered version of this photo. And maybe I wanted to select this layer mask, grab a brush and paint with black to have more of his eyes and face show up, or something like that. So now I'm done editing this version, the original version. I just wanted to do a little tweak here. So I'll go back up to File and Save and File and Close. And now my little bit of an edit, which wasn't too terribly visible, will be applied. And the Lightroom adjustment has unchanged because I just worked on the underlying version of the file. That gives me the flexibility to go, that is hideous. So if I switch back over to Develop, I can reset the Lightroom adjustment. That has no effect on the original layers of the PSD. So this is why we have that maximize compatibility option that we just looked at in Photoshop, because Lightroom Classic can only see what's called the composite layer, meaning the result of all the layers. And that is what we're seeing here in Lightroom Classic. And then we're applying additional edits if we choose to, and we don't often do that. We don't always do that. Those additional edits will be applied on top of the composite. If I were to choose the edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, let's just say I wanted that, that color graded version. Now I would want to do a better version of that color grade, but let's just say that I wanted to now put all of those edits together. Now I would need to make a new copy, right? So I would choose edit a copy with my color grade, sure. And now I've got a third version, right? So now there's my two original pieces for my composite. There's this composite plus this new copy that is a merged result of all of those, because now I'm going to do something else, right? It's best, I think, to keep yourself sane, to try to do all your base edits in Lightroom Classic, then go to Photoshop when you have to, when you've done all the things you can do in Lightroom, and then you're doing a finishing move. Or maybe you're doing a composite, so you're editing those first, and then you're selecting those together, putting them together in a composite, and now you've got a finished file. Could you still edit this in Lightroom Classic? You sure could, and maybe there'd be good reason to do that, but you want to be conscious of all of these steps in your workflow. So, for example, the same way I did this composite, let's say I want to select these and I want to combine the smoky part here with the gun muzzle fire here to make it look more dramatic. So I can select both of these here, and there's another option under Edit In, way down at the bottom, to open as layers in Photoshop. So I can select multiple layers here in Lightroom Classic and then use that Open as Layers command. This could be great for focus stacking, if you're doing like a star trail, if you're doing a composite like this, multiple different ways. Fireworks, and you want to layer all the different fireworks images together using blending mode to make a final really cool looking fireworks shot. So both of those images opened in a single document with each image on its own layer, and with the layer name being replaced with the file name for each one. It's pretty cool. That's a pretty neat thing. And if I turn off visibility, so there's my smoke, there's my fire, right? And this was obviously taken in a burst, so most everyone is in the same right place. I just want to grab the smoke. So the smoke is on the bottom, the fire is on the top. I can apply a layer mask to that. I got my brush, paint with black. And again, I'm just doing a quick job here, and I'm just bringing in the smoke. Right? I would take more time if I was trying to make this a real concerted effort here, but you get the idea. So I'm just painting in with black on the layer mask, and I'm just combining these two layers together. Don't want to take any more time on that, but you get the idea. So there's my edit, and now I go to File, Save, Command or Control S, and Command or Control W will close that out. Once the saving is done, it will disappear from here. And now when I come back over to Lightroom Classic, we're going to see a new copy that is the merged result of these two layers that has the smoke from one and the fire from the other in this PSD file format. All right, so that's another way to work and why you might go over to Photoshop. You want to combine multiple images into a single image. Here is a fireworks shot. So if I expand the stack, right, here's all the individual elements of this. If I right click on this and choose Open in Photoshop, choose Edit Original, because I want to see all the layers. And once the layered file opened, I made this one in the same exact way. I selected all the layers. I chose Open as layers in Photoshop, and there they are. And so by just setting the blending mode to lighten on all these, it combines them into a much more dramatic looking shot. Another good reason to go over to Photoshop from Lightroom Classic. What would be another reason? Maybe there's a feature, Photoshop, that doesn't exist in Lightroom Classic that you want to take advantage of, that you need to take advantage of. So for example, this raw photo, I took at Photoshop World back in the day, and it's a little blurry. It's a little soft. I was in a hurry. Okay, I was in a hurry. And I was going to delete it, but I remembered, oh, there's a camera shake filter inside of Photoshop. So I'm going to press Command and Control E to send this on over to Photoshop. Was an NEF file. So if we just zoom in here, you can see it's just soft. All right. So this is the raw file. It's soft. It's all my fault as the photographer. So I thought, well, maybe could I improve this? Could I fix it in some way? So if I make this a smart object, just so I can apply a smart filter to it to make it easier to just do before and after view. So I go up to Filter, come down to Sharpen and Shake Reduction. Now I'm not going to mess around with the shake reduction options here. I'm just going to let it do its defaults and click OK, just so I can show you this is why you might come, right? So that's with shake reduction. That's before. Let it render. And after. Yeah, that's much better. And especially if I were to, maybe resize this a little smaller, if this was the only shot I had, that might be enough, right? So maybe Photoshop is there to save you from yourself, right? On those instances when you need a little help. Sometimes we've all been there. We all needed a little bit of extra help. So I'm going to save this out. I'm not going to save that version, but that's just an example of when you might come into Photoshop to do something that Lightroom Classic doesn't have the capability of doing, right? What if every time you go into Photoshop, say for editing, maybe you have certain steps that you take all the time, and maybe you can build that into a single kind of one-step workflow. So for example, let me select this original file again. I'm going to send it over to Photoshop to do an edit. Now, before I applied an action for sharpening, right? And maybe that's part of what I do. What if, what a lot of people do when they come into Photoshop is they immediately start by duplicating the layer. So you can select in the layers menu here, duplicate layer, or you can press Command and Control J, whatever you want to do. And we'll call this my working version, because I want to do some destructive edits. And so I want to preserve a working or an original version if I need to. And so having a duplicate version, that's a common step that I do in a workflow. Another thing you might do, especially if you're going to zoom into 100% to do that work, is if you go into the window menu and arrange, you can create a new window for the same image, right? And maybe have that view at 100%, right? So you can look at it close up and look at it far away. And then if you go to this arrange menu, you can tile them together. And now you have the option to look at the same file in two different views. Maybe that's a helpful step in your workflow. And maybe it's something that you would do all the time. And so if I just grab my brush here, just so you can see what I'm talking about, so if I paint with black here, that's where it appears. So this just gives you a way to maybe look at the final version as you're looking up close, right? Just a bunch of different steps that you might take repetitively over a course of a workflow. So could you put all those into an action? Yeah, I had an action for the sharpening. You can have an action for duplicating a layer. You can even have an action for duplicating the view and setting 1 to 100%. Whatever those things might be to help you in your workflow, you can start to bundle them in and become more efficient in that process. So, for example, let me just revert this image back to our starting point here, where I just had a single layer. So here is an action that duplicates the layer, right? Duplicated it, renamed it, the original one to original, hid its visibility, and rename the duplicate as working. And so that's the steps in this action. How do you make an action? Well, that's a course in itself, but if I wanted to duplicate that same type of an action, all I have to do is reset this back to its default and create a new action, and we'll call this dupe background. So we have another one there. And I click record, and then I would just do the steps that I want to have included in the action. You don't have to rush. I'm going to rush just for the sake of time, but I want to duplicate the layer, and I'm going to call this working. Click OK, and I'm going to double click on this one and name it original and turn off its visibility and then stop recording. Right? That's how I made that other action. Once you've made that action, as soon as you come into Photoshop, maybe you've got a set of actions that you just fire off right from the beginning. When I created the one here, let me revert this back, it had those same beginning steps, and then I added into it the option to create additional windows. So now when I come in, I've got my layers duplicated, and I've got a kind of step back view and a close-up view ready to go if I'm doing a retouching type of work. That's pretty cool. So once you start creating actions to help you in this workflow from Lightroom Classic, you could take it a step even further. So let me just close out of here for a second. And I'll even close out of here. Once you've got your actions, if I click on this, we'll come back in here. Once you've got your actions building, and there's no end to building actions, they're really powerful things, you can take that action and turn it into what's called a droplet. A droplet is basically an executable version of your action that can exist outside of Photoshop. So if you come down to the File, Automate menu, there's an option here called Create Droplet. If you want to keep it really simple, and I recommend that you do, choose where you want it to save. So let me just save it to my desktop, right? That's an easy place to find. And I'll use my duplicate background layer. So what action will you choose here? First, you go to your set, right? Your actions live in an action set. And so that's in my starting place. And which action do I want? I'll choose the background layer one. Depending on what's in your action, and there isn't much in this one, you can choose some additional things to override or include. And I usually have the suppress file opening warnings, even though we shouldn't have any, and the color profiles, since we shouldn't have any. And there's not a save option here. This is really just a starting place for me. But you could, in your actions, include saving them out and really have an all-in-one kind of action that just does everything and spits out finished versions. That's not what this one's going to do. So for destination, I'm going to leave that set to none. So that droplet, now, if I open up my Finder, is just sitting on my desktop, ready for me to go. So the way a droplet works is you can just drag and drop a photo onto it and it will run the action. The way you can tie that into Lightroom Classic is in the export dialog. So let's say instead of sending that file over via that edit in menu, I wanted to speed up that process and have it play that droplet as part of the process. If I select my original RAW file here and click export, on the export dialog, I can configure all the same file settings that we saw inside that additional and external editor preference panel, including save it to the same folder as the original photo. In this case, I can have it go to a subfolder, but let's say I don't want to do that. I want to just add this iterative copy right to the catalog, just like the edit in Photoshop, add it to a stack, just like in when we're sending it over to Photoshop. I can choose a file naming convention, just like in Photoshop. I can set my file format here the same as that other command. I could choose to resize. I won't. I'm not going to sharpen. And here's the real cue. Instead of setting it to just open in Photoshop, which would be fine to do, I'm going to go down to this Export Actions folder. The Export Actions folder lives somewhat in your file system. It's a place where a lot of other templates and where your presets, your developed presets used to live. But in this Export Actions folder, you can place those droplets. Now, I already have one in there of that same name, but if I go to my desktop, there's that same droplet. It already exists in that location. But I would just drag it and drop it into that Export Actions folder. It's already in there, so I don't want to add another one. There's no point in doing that. Then what you do in this stage is you can select your droplet. So now when I click export, it will export this copy, do all of these settings that I've dialed in, including running that action as soon as it opens in Photoshop. So I'll click on export. It's already got, yes, I know. So we'll say unique names, since I've already done it. And now when I come into Photoshop, it just did those things, right? It duplicated the layer. So taking that another step further, you can, on your export dialog, choose my other starting place. That way I get the additional views and zoomed in, and then save that as a preset, right? So I have some workflow presets. That way, within my workflow preset, I can duplicate the background, set my views, do whatever else I want to do in my action, and all of those things will happen just by clicking the export button. So if I click out of that one, want to say, I'll just select a different photo here. I go up to my File, Export with Preset command. I can come down to my workflow set and choose my Photoshop Start Editing preset. I already got one of those. I've done this before. And when it opens up inside of Photoshop, it's all ready to go. My droplet's been run on it. I've got the views, and I can begin my close-up retouching or whatever it is that I'm coming in here to do. So what I'm trying to show you here is you can go beyond that edit in Photoshop command and have a bunch of other steps done by the time your photo opens in Photoshop for you. And with the same result being that your copy will end up back inside of Lightroom Classic as well, in almost the same way as if you use that command to send it from Photoshop. It's a pretty kind of wild way to work and take advantage of some things along the way. In a similar vein, another way of using Photoshop from Lightroom Classic that I like to rely on is via export when I'm delivering a file, say, to a client or for uploading to get printed, or just when it's leaving my hands and I want to give it a one last look to make sure I'm delivering the correct file. And it's a simpler version of what I just showed you, but is to use the export and possibly to resize and change the, so say I was sending this off to get printed or something like that. I can save it back to the same folder as original, configure all my file size, file naming, all that kind of stuff, but just have it simply open in Photoshop as a last step. So that way I'm creating my copy, dialed into my specifications, but now here in Photoshop, I can verify the color space, I can verify the bit depth, I can zoom into 100% and check focus and check that I didn't mess up anything. And then when I'm happy with that, then I can, in good conscience, deliver it off to wherever it's going in the next stage of the game. Using these two programs together gives you a wide range of flexibility for all these different points in your workflow. And you just need to think about, how can I get the most out of it for the job that is at hand now? Is it just a simple finishing move, such as applying some sharpening? Or am I starting with two finished photos in Lightroom and I'm compositing them together in some way to make a final composite? Or am I taking advantage of a feature that doesn't exist in Lightroom Classic specifically to help me get the job done, such as blending a bunch of fireworks images together or doing a star trail or a focus stack? As you start to see these different kind of levels of working, then it opens up all kinds of possibilities. The more proficient you get with Photoshop to make those actions, maybe save those actions as droplets, and just become more efficient and building on it. And you might find, as your eye changes and you learn more, you'll go back and change some of those actions to do more, to do less, and continue to refine that type of workflow. Now, there's one more aspect of all this that I wanted to show you before I run out of time. And that is how you could maybe put some of Lightroom Classic's functionality together and access it inside of Photoshop. So let's say I want to work on this photo, and I've worked on it here in Lightroom Classic. It's already edited, you can see that. But I want to send this over as a smart object in Photoshop. Now, this is a raw file. When you choose Open as a Smart Object, it embeds a full resolution copy of whatever the file type you selected. In this case, it was a raw file. And it embeds it into that Smart Object layer. That means, in this case, since it was a raw file, I have a full resolution version of the raw file embedded in this Smart Object. What does that mean? Well, that means I could actually double click on this Smart Object layer, and it's going to open in Camera Raw, right? Remember, it's a copy of my original raw file. This isn't tied back to the original raw file. It's a copy of it embedded into this Smart Object layer. But I have access to all the same controls that are in the Develop module. They're just in a slightly different orientation. So if you're new to using Camera Raw, and a lot of people who use Lightroom Classic never come into Camera Raw, this is one area where you might want to get familiar with Camera Raw, just so you're not disoriented when it opens. They recently gave Camera Raw a facelift, and it looks a whole lot more like Lightroom now. So it's a little bit easier for Lightroom people to get adapted to Camera Raw. It threw off people who use Camera Raw a little bit. But here's a cool part. Because Lightroom Classic and Camera Raw share the same presets, all of your presets from Lightroom Classic are available here to you inside of Lightroom, inside of Camera Raw. So if nothing else, you can just use your presets to help you go down the road. Additionally, inside of Camera Raw, if you created snapshots in Lightroom Classic, those snapshots are also available, all right? And so I have a snapshot of just the default state, and so I can access that inside of here. If I had created different versions, different snapshots with different editing versions, those would be available to me inside of here. So when you send over a smart object of your original raw file, any snapshots you create in Lightroom Classic come along for the ride. And all your presets are shared between the two programs. So this gives you a way to access stuff from both programs and edit this inside of the Camera Raw plugin. This just gives you additional flexibility if maybe you thought, well, I want to continue editing this and maybe possibly change things if I'm doing something in Photoshop that makes it look poorly, right? And so you by having that smart object layer, you can do that inside of here. And one way, additionally, to take advantage of having a smart object is another way to use Camera Raw, right? So if you have a raw file embedded in a smart object layer and you double click it, you will open that raw file or that copy of the raw file in the Camera Raw interface. And you're actually working on the raw data. But Camera Raw also exists as a filter. And in this case, if you use Camera Raw as a filter, you're not really working on the raw data anymore, and you don't have all of the same controls as the individual Camera Raw plugin. But you do have the color grading and some and kind of the key color shifting and tonal shifting controls that exist in the full Camera Raw plugin. Why this might be useful to you is color grading. Color grading is often good to do as your last step, right? And if I have, say, a preset that includes some color grading, right, I can apply that preset in the Camera Raw filter. That's pretty cool. And now I can come in and click OK. Because I have a smart object, I have a smart filter, so I can turn that off. It's kind of a subtle color grade. But what you can do beyond that, because you have it as a smart filter, if you double click this guy right here, you have the option to even change the opacity of your Camera Raw filter. So maybe you had your color grade and you just wanted to dial it down by half. And now you've got your presets on a slider. And that's kind of cool too. So being familiar with Lightroom Classic's Develop module, you want to also be fluent-ish with the Camera Raw plugin so that you can use Camera Raw as a filter, in this case, or should you send over a raw file embedded as a smart object and you need to open it up into Camera Raw and access the raw data, maybe you wanted to change the profile, right? So I did a little color grading on that filter, but what about if I come into the profile browser and this shares the same profiles that you have inside of Lightroom Classic as well. So maybe I want to choose a more dramatic profile. Just clicking one by chance there. And so now that profile will update the look of the colors in there. And then my Camera Raw filter with the color grade is being applied on top of that. Gives you additional flexibility, non-destructive workflow, still working with the original raw file, and now you've got your color grade on a slider that you can play around with and create to your heart's content. There's a lot of power in these two programs together. You don't have to always use Photoshop, but it is good to know what it can do when you need to do more than what Lightroom Classic can do by itself. So I hope you found all that helpful. I know it's a lot to take in. If you get the VIP pass, you're going to have this workbook that goes through all the steps for creating droplets and for creating the actions that I created, step by step through these workflows and the settings that I showed you. Plus a couple more things that I might pack in there. I appreciate your time and attention, and I hope you are getting a lot out of the Lightroom Virtual Summit. Take good care.